Erev Tov. Tonight we are
Erev Tov.
continuing our journey on looking at cases in Jewish business ethics. And again, these are relevant to our world. And one of the cool things about these cases is the more you start thinking about them, the more you see principles that apply over here and pop up over here. There'll be one we'll actually see tonight, very cursorily connected, that we saw a while ago. But what I'm going to do is present the first case, we'll talk it out, and then we'll look at some of the sources. So just reminding myself the first case. So the first case is, I have a catering company and I've been hired to cater a wedding. So I hire 10 people. They've had general experience before. They seem to be trustworthy and stuff. They know what they're doing. Then after the wedding, I go back, I'm going through all the invoices and everything like that. And I get a call from the mother of the bride who says that her engagement ring has gone missing. Now, things like that happen, except when they look at the footage, they have security footage, they see that one of my employees clearly picked up the ring, pocketed it, and left. So the question is, welcome, Ed. This is the case where I'm a caterer and one of my employees stole a ring at a wedding, clear evidence of it. And the question is, I, as the caterer who hired these people, do I have responsibility, A, if they can't find this person, to pay for the ring? It's a $15,000 ring. Am I responsible for that? Or am I responsible, I guess, or am I responsible to track down my employee? Now, if I call them and say, I knew you stole it, just give it back, and they say, I'm sorry, back, easy peasy. But what is my responsibility as the caterer who hired these people? Thoughts?
Well, I'll jump in. My reaction is that, yeah, you are liable. And I think you could only get out of being that if you prove that you had done due diligence in finding the background of your employees, and references and things like that, to show that you really made an effort as much as you could to that cause problems.
Very good. But it's interesting. The question is, how far do I have to go in background checks? Do I need to call the federal government and have a psychological profile? Or these are people who have done it before. And like in general, like I didn't find somebody in a dark alley who was, holding a bag of drugs. And I said, put the drugs down. I got a job for you. How far does that go? But your point is very well taken, is, if I really did pick people and I knew nothing about them, maybe I would have more responsibility. But on the other hand, if I did do diligence and one of them still stole, do I have any liability?
Well, I would say there's probably some kind of level of standard that's acceptable in these situations. And if you met that, then I would say no, then you are not responsible.
Okay, very good.
Fortunately, probably they'd come after you anyhow.
That's the American way, as it were. Excellent, Elizabeth. So Gloria, welcome. So the case was, very shortly, I'm a caterer, hired some people. One of them stole a ring. It was a wedding I was catering, stole a ring. There's security footage. The question is, if we can't get the ring back, am I, as the caterer who hired these people, responsible to pay back for it? Do I have to chase down the person? Tamar, yeah?
Is it clear that it was stolen and not just misplaced or gotten lost?
That's a great question. We're going to come back to that in one of the sources, but no, in this case, it's 100% very obvious that this person stole it. That the security footage saw them look around, check, make sure no one was there, pick it up, pocket it very carefully in their pocket, and then flutter away. Like there's very little doubt.
I see.
Yeah. Any other?
To me, it seems as though maybe, as the employer, you do bear more responsibility than the average citizen, right? The average citizen, it's not their job to find this person, a person at the party, it's not their job to find out what happened and, get everything figured out. You were responsible to a degree for this person's behavior. Now, I don't know if that necessarily translates into anything monetarily, but it does seem like you do bear more responsibility for assisting the client in getting the problem solved, however that may be.
That's excellent. I want to point out two things that you said. One is, you seem to imply that I wouldn't necessarily have to pay back for the engagement ring, but I might have responsibility to help them track down my employee. But you did say one thing that we'll come back to, which is that I'm responsible for their behavior. Think about that statement for a moment. is that true? Am I responsible for what can I control what they do on a fundamental level?
And well, no, I suppose you can't control. No one can control anybody but themselves.
So we'll come.
For
By the
sure.
way, I don't disagree with you on all of your points, but I'm pushing on that, as you'll see in one of our sources.
Sure.
Excellent, Ed. Yeah, Gloria, please.
Does a caterer normally have like insurance to cover?
As with all of, first of all, it's an excellent question. As with all of the cases I ever bring, there's often something written in somewhere that, you know, might deal with this kind of thing about lost property, et cetera, like that. But the truth is, this is something that probably wouldn't be covered by most contracts. Now, there may be local secular law, like civil law. If I do it in, you know, Milwaukee, they might have something on the books. But usually you wouldn't write it in the contract. If one of my employees steals from you, then I have to pay it back. Usually, and we will talk about that as well, we'll say that if damage is done, and of course, let's say washing dishes and we smash some of the dishes, that kind of stuff is written in the contract. So in this case, there's nothing explicit. We're going in the world where there's no clear contract that deals with this particular issue. So we're merely talking about what should be done and what seems to be right in this case. But that's one of the first questions anyone would ask. Is there anything in the contract to deal with this? But again, not all, but many, if not most of these types of cases in Jewish law happen because there's not a clear contract. But again, in the States and the modern world today, there's often local law that we could probably turn to. Any other thoughts before we jump into our first set of sources? Excellent, everybody. You brought up really the best points. Okay, so the first place to talk to is we're actually going to look at extremes is not the right word, but two different ways of approaching my employees or my property or those that work for me and the kind of damage they do. So we're going to talk about a scale. So on one edge of the scale, we're going to talk about if my animals do damage. So Elizabeth, if you would please take source number 1. And here forget about the Talmud, not forget about the Talmud. We're going all the way back to the Torah, to the book of Shemot, Exodus, where it says it pretty clearly in a few examples. So go ahead, Elizabeth, source number 1 from Shemot, when a man opens.
When a man opens up a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it up, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit is to pay the worth in silver he is to restore to its owner,
and the dead animal is to remain his. When the man's ox deals a blow to his neighbor's ox so that it dies, they are to sell the live ox and split its worth in silver, and the dead animal they are also to split. Yet if it was known that it was a goring ox from yesterday and the day before, and its owner did not guard it, he is to pay, yes, pay an ox in place of the ox, and the dead animal is to remain his.
Excellent, thank you. That last thing is just talking about if my animal does damage, the amount that I have to pay depends on if this animal is known to be a dangerous animal. If it has a reputation of it, then I should have been more careful with it. But the takeaway of both of these cases, I dig a hole in the ground and someone falls in and gets hurt, or they drop something in there, or one of my animals either kills another animal, or God forbid, kills another person, I take full responsibility. Why? And this goes back, Ed, to your comment. Am I responsible for the behavior of my hole? Do I control where my hole is dug? And the answer to that is a simple yes.
Yes.
Now, animals, technically, it's a little tricky. Obviously, I don't have mind control. I'm not like a snake charmer. But realistically, with an animal, where at least within the perspective of Torah law, and practically speaking, I do control my animal. I have much more control over them. And this includes, dogs, oxes, etc. Even if I let an animal run free and I say, don't run into things, and I can't make a dog do that, I'm responsible for tying them up, for training them, etc. like that. So on the one side, in the case of a physical hole or an animal that belongs to me, I have full responsibility to control them. Any damage caused by that kind of property of mine that I put into the world, I have full responsibility for. So if I was catering a wedding with a bunch of oxen, then yes, and they ate an engagement ring, yes, or a goat, that would be a better thing, because they really do that. If I had a pet goat and it ate something and destroyed it, that would be my responsibility. But on the flip side, this is about holes in oxen. We're talking about a human being. And the question is, can I be responsible for the action of a human being? And a very similar case, that is super relevant, certainly in my life and to some of you at different points in your life, is somebody's pushing a child in a stroller or in a shopping cart through a marketplace. They turn their head to say hi to the friend, and the child grabs a glass jar of mayonnaise and smashes it on the ground. Now, again, we're not talking about whether it's right to pay back for that. Of course it is. We're talking about, do I, as the parent, have responsibility for my child who's under the age of 13? If my child is 13, why are they in a stroller? And B, they're legally an adult, so they're responsible for their actions. But is a minor, am I responsible for their actions? And the source for it is actually a Mishnah, but the way it says it is very confusing. And even here where I bring the Shulchan Aruch from the 16th century, it's still a little confusing. So we'll read it and I'll explain how it relates to our case. So Tamar, if you would take source number 2, and this is not word for word, but it's basically right out of the Mishnah, I think in Bava Kama. This is basically what it rules there, and that's been passed down for thousands of years, or at least 1,500 plus years. Go ahead, please, Tamar.
If one injures a deaf mute, full or minor, he is liable. If they injured another, they would be exempt. Even if the deaf mute is healed and full becomes sane, or the minor becomes an adult, they would not be required to pay because at the time they were injured, they were lacking capacity.
Okay, so the simple context of this is somebody who either has a developmental delay or a small child who doesn't really understand their actions. If somebody hurts them, as they are another human being, that person is liable. Just because they don't really understand what's going on, no, we don't have permission to harm them. However, if they do an action, i.e. my child knocks over a jar of mayonnaise and they're under the age of 13, they don't really understand what they're doing, therefore they're not culpable for it. However, this is the thing that's not explicitly said, but understood by everybody. And Rav Moshe Feinstein talks about this in a ruling, which is that even though this minor or this person with, mental delays isn't able to fully understand what they're doing, they're still a human being and their mind cannot be controlled by me. Their mind is independent. So I am not responsible for the actions of my minor child, regardless of whether they understand what they're doing. So even though that's not explicitly said here, this ruling leads to the understanding that, again, if a minor does something, I'm not responsible for it because they have their own mind, unlike an animal or a pit, as it were. So applied to our case here, the question is, my employees, are they more like my animals? God forbid, that's a horrible way to think about humans, but are they more like property that I control, or like an independent human being? Now, obviously, they're an adult. They have full mental, their faculties. So my employee, again, here's a simple question. Is my employee, who's an adult, responsible for their action? Do they have an obligation to return the lost property? Are they culpable for stealing? The answer to that is a simple
Yes.
yes. But based on the understanding and how this ruling on the Shulchan Aruch, which is that the mind of a human, I can't control the mind of a human, am I responsible for what one of my employees does? And the answer is no. No. Now, again, if this went before a Beit Din, I think, Elizabeth, you had talked about, you have to do your due diligence and stuff like that. Now, that doesn't really seem to come up much in the laws about how much extent I did background checking and stuff, et cetera, like that. But I could see a Beit Din, a court ruling that if I really hired criminals, which, by the way, a reformed criminal, there's nothing wrong with hiring them. We should hire more of them. They should be given more rights and integrated in society. But I'm talking about somebody who's actively a criminal, known to be doing it, might be on drugs at the time. If I hire someone like that, then maybe a Beit Din would force me to pay. But strictly speaking, I didn't steal it. That's the thing here. I didn't steal it. I can't control another human being. Again, I'll repeat that because that's the key fundamental thing. I didn't steal it because I cannot control another human being. So we're not done. We're going to look at two more relevant sources for our conversation, but are there any questions on that first thing relevant to our case? Which is ultimately no, I wouldn't have to pay it back because I can't control what another person does. Yeah, Gloria, please.
So you were giving the example before of a child, a minor child in a shopping cart, and the mother turns around to speak to somebody and the kid breaks the jar on the ground. Isn't the mother responsible for that?
Yes, I would say yes.
So the answer, again, the case in the Mishnah is, so it's interesting, the case in the Mishnah and maybe in the Gemara as well, goes on a little bit more about that, about a child doing damage. And that's actually really where we, the Mishnah in its fuller version gives us more the ideas that are relevant to this case, because they say the child is exempt from their damage, but they would have to pay it back later, or they're expected to pay it back later. But that makes it quite explicit that the mother has no responsibility for this other human being. Again, if the child's 13 or up, it's on them. But again, while I should be responsible, and ethically, by the way, Rav Moshe Feinstein says that the parent probably should pay back for it. But should and obligation are not the same thing. Now, again, to our sensibilities, we think, oh, well, the parent's responsible for watching their child. But again, the fundamental principle here is one cannot control the mind of another human being. And anyone who's raised little kids knows that to be very, very true. And even with the best intentions, with a 7 or an 8-year-old, sometimes their brains literally are sometimes incapable of controlling their impulses. And that's not bad. It's part of being a human being and growing up. But to be penalized for not being able to control the neural pathways of another human being makes little sense. To be penalized for putting a hole or setting up some sort of construction thing in the public sidewalk, or leaving my tools, this is a case I talked about in the past, leaving my tools in the public sidewalk, that I should be responsible for. Not tying up my dog, that I should be responsible for. But for a child, fundamentally I can't be. And again, obligated versus right thing to do are not always equal. Many would say, again, I should, and what they say again in the Mishnah is that when the child is older, they should go back and pay for the damage that they did, which is both a learning experience and, consistent with it. Yeah, Gloria, please.
Yeah, but say that is 5 years or 7 years, in the future.
It's interesting. So again, obviously, practically speaking, that doesn't always work out. I mean, my kids are, Mikey is 6, or even Jakey, who's 22 months, he's gotten birthday gifts, and we could use that money if it's major damage. And by the way, again, local laws may come into play here, but personally from experience, if one of my kids accidentally spills something, and I apologize, most people understand it's a child. That's, again, what the Mishnah is pointing out. This is not a person who's controlled their faculties. If it was my 15-year-old son, they'd make my 15-year-old son pay for it, clean it up, et cetera, like that. But with the child, they're forgiving. They know it's an accident. And again, because I can't control their actions, when this has happened to me, not the mayonnaise, but similar things. I was visiting family, and Meira, who was much younger, went to a potted plant and emptied out half the dirt. Of course, we offered to clean up and stuff like that, but they totally understood that it was a little girl. They weren't mad at us. They weren't mad at her. Her because she's a little girl, and us because you can't control a child. Those are the things there. And again, relevant to our case, because obviously my employee is responsible for their actions, but I can't control what another, and I shouldn't be able to control what another human being does. And they even talk about this in the context of a slave. Someone says, fine, a slave must be an exception. And no, it's consistent. Even a slave who in the Torah, an Israelite would fully own them, if that slave does damage, the owner is not responsible for it, because you can't control another human being's mind. But to your point, Gloria, again, Rav Moshe and others would say one should pay it back or offer to pay it back. But again, experientially, most people are, unless it's like $1,000 of damage, most people are like, it's totally fine, don't worry about it. And I think it's a recognition of those underlying principles. Yeah, other thoughts? But I very much hear you, Gloria, which is why I think the rulings like Rav Moshe kind of try and find a compromise here about, again, what's obligated, but what we should probably do instead of waiting for them to grow up and decide to make tshuva or something like that. Excellent. So there were two more points that we, one more point that we didn't talk about, which is, or I did kind of talk about it, which is, what if my employees are cleaning up? One of their roles is to clean up the tables and put stuff in the trash. And they accidentally, when they're putting in the trash, they're supposed to be very careful because we don't want to throw away the knives and the forks or the plates, they're just supposed to scrape off the food, but they're not being careful and they scrape the engagement ring into the trash bag, or they're washing dishes and they're being negligent and they smash the dishes. So this is part of the job that they're doing. So Ed, if you would read source number 3, also from the 16th century Shulchan Aruch. Go ahead. If one gave
an item to a craftsman to repair, and the craftsman damaged it, he would be required to pay. How so? If one gave a chest, box, or cabinet to a carpenter for him to put in a nail and the item broke, or if he gave wood to create a chest, box, or cabinet and the item broke after it was made, the craftsman must pay for the value of the chest, box, or cabinet, because a craftsman does not acquire the appreciation of the vessel. See Evan Hazer 28:16. If a builder contracted to destroy a wall and he broke or damaged the stones, he would be required to pay.
Excellent. So Evan Hazer is actually there's 4 sections to the Shulchan Aruch. Evan Hazer is the 3rd section, has to do with literally the helper stone. It has to do with the laws of marriage. So we'd have to look there and see what the relevance is. But that last line is actually the most relevant here. If a builder was contracted to destroy a wall, and in destroying the wall, like if someone's coming to my house to paint my wall and they smash through one of the windows, they have to pay for that. Say, oh, it's an accident or something like that. No, the responsibility for a job, if there's damage done within the job where one is supposed to be careful, then the contractor, i.e. me, is responsible for my employees. So if I'm not watching my employees and say, when you paint this wall, when you wash the dishes, you need to be careful, then it would fall on me. So because this person stealing the ring was outside of my purview, meaning my job as the contractor is to make sure they serve the food right, they wash the dishes correctly, they clean the floor right. My job is paid to make sure that they do the things we're supposed to do responsibly. That will fall on me. That will come out of my pocket, or somehow I have to make restitution. But if they do something that is totally unrelated to the job and I didn't know about it, then it wouldn't fall on me. So again, there's that distinction. I am responsible for the actions that they're doing that we're paid to do and make sure that they're doing them right. But if they do something completely out of the job description, then I'm not responsible for that. Any questions on that? Beautiful.
It reminds me of like the concept of mens rea, like the criminal mind. You know, like it's almost as though if it's accidental, then yeah, you're responsible for it. But if they go outside the bounds, they have a malign intent.
But that's kind of what's, and that you picked up the key thing there is, in Hebrew we would say kavana, which comes from the word for direction, but intent. In this case, the thing is, I can't control, again, technically you can't control an animal's intent, but that's not how we rule. That's not how the Torah understands it. But you definitely cannot control a human being's intent. And if their intent is to do a criminal act, I can't control that. I can take responsibility because I'm paid to make sure they wash the dishes well, or whatever our job is, or paint the walls, but I cannot control their actions outside of that. Again, if there's a contract that says that any damage that they do while they're here, or if they have like there was a painter working on my parents' house like 20 some odd years ago, and I think in retrospect he was very funny, but at the time he was kind of crass and used bad words. Can we like get him in trouble for that, or is that unrelated to the job? Things like that. So a contract can become important. But here, yes, I cannot control their intent. But the last thing, I don't remember who brought this up. Oh, Ed, you actually brought it up, which is fine. Maybe I don't have to pay for the engagement ring, but do I have a responsibility to go out of my way to try and get the ring back? And the answer to that is yes. And it's actually related to a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah in Hebrew, hashavat avedah, literally returning lost property. Now, in this case, the usual way the mitzvah works is if I find something, I have a responsibility to return it to the person within reason. You know, if I realize that it's in Lake Park Synagogue, I put something in an email, or maybe I make a call or ask around, and I've done that before. Is anyone, I found something, does anyone know who it belongs to? But let's say I find something, the only way to return it is I have to get on a plane and go to Paris and spend thousands of dollars. No, I do not have to put myself out financially and give up, like not go to work for a day. I have to do reasonable things to return property. But the rabbis understand the mitzvah of returning lost property a little bit more broadly as protecting the property of others and trying to help people keep the property they have. So while this is a broader definition of returning lost property, we absolutely would apply it here. And specifically in our case, we would talk about, would I have to testify in court or something like that? So Gloria, if you want to take source number 4.
Anyone who knows testimony that another has a use for and is fit to testify is obligated to testify if he is called to testify in court.
So if my employee goes to court, I would be obligated as a positive commandment to go out of my way to show up in court or to call them, et cetera. So there's some actions. Now, again, there's a limit to how far I have to go. And technically speaking, with a positive mitzvah, if I don't do it, I haven't sinned, I haven't broken law, I've missed an opportunity. Like there's an obligation for a Jew to shake the lulav on Sukkot. I'm supposed to do that, but if I don't do that, I haven't sinned per se, I've missed an opportunity. It's not great, but there's no punishment for it, no consequences for me. So if she says, the bride or the mother of the bride says, you need to help us find this ring. And I say, well, according to Jewish law, I really don't. Technically, that's true. However, is there a responsibility for me? Should I do it? Yes. Or I guess the way I say it is, are there consequences if I don't help? No. Am I obligated to help? Yes, but only to a certain extent. We need you to, let's say I flew out for this wedding. We need you to fly out again and get a hotel for 2 weeks, track down this person, hire a bounty hunter. Do I have to do that? No. But if I have their contact, should I share it? Should I give all the information I have in an email and, call 1 or 2 people and try and track this person down? Yeah, that's reasonable. If there's a lawyer who says, can I record you or can you write up testimony? Because we're going to use this to basically sue the person and have them pay for it. Should I do that? And the answer is definitely yes. So again, the absolute technical, I don't say worst case scenario, the bare minimum of this is I could just walk away and say, no, it's not my fault. I have nothing to do with it. That's not nice. I really should help. But in terms of they say they were your employee, you owe us $15,000. Nobody says that. Nobody says that. But if my employees that I hired do a horrible job and they smash and break all of the dishes and scratch all the silverware, do I have to pay for that? Yes. So those are the 2 spectrums are on the scale of it. So any questions before we go to case 2? Excellent. So what I'll do, as I said before, is I'm going to stop sharing the screen, describe the second case, and then we'll go back to the sources. So the second case may even have happened to some of you before. So somebody is moving out of their house. They have all their stuff packed up. They're actually in an apartment building, and the movers are there. It's Sunday. They have 2 hours to pack everything up. And the person realizes they left 3 really important boxes, very heavy boxes, in the basement of the apartment in a locked storage area. And there's no way that they can transfer them. They need the movers to do it. If they want the movers to come back, it'll cost a lot of money, or to rent a U-Haul and to hire someone to help them carry it. They're going to lose a lot of money if they don't get these boxes out of the storage room. And I'm repeating that because that's important. The person moving will lose money if they don't get into that storage room. Problem is, there's only one key to the storage room, and it is the superintendent. I don't know if that's the right word. It's the person who oversees the landlord of the building, and they happen to be on vacation. I call them. There's no backup key. There's no nothing. The only way I can get into this is bolt cutters, which I happen to have. I can cut off the lock, damage the property that doesn't technically belong to me, get out the boxes. But I'm going to make this case seem a little bit nicer and maybe a little easier. As soon as the movers get it out, I'm going to run to Walmart and I'm going to pick up a new lock. I'm not a jerk. I'm not just going to cut the lock and run for it. The question is, do I have permission to damage and break the lock, even though I intend to fix it? Can I break the lock to save myself hundreds of dollars or more, knowing I'm going to fix it? That's the case here. And this may seem like a simple one, but think about it, because fundamentally, what am I doing? Thoughts? It's a fun one. Yeah, Gloria.
I would do it.
I could do it too.
Well, I could say, well, take a vote now. How many of you would, regardless of whether it's permitted or not, if you were in that situation, how many of you would cut the lock? Yeah, exactly. But the question is, does one have permission to do it?
I feel like strictly speaking, I would say no. I mean, it is an act of vandalism, even if
That's what
you
it looks like.
rectify it after the fact, the act itself is still wrong.
Good, excellent. Yeah, any other thoughts?
I suppose that if you were thinking legalistically, you would ask the landlord, was it okay, and be taping his answer. So that when he said yes, if there were ever any repercussions, you would say, well, I had permission.
Yeah, the reality, this is not a good system. And I think the last time my wife and I lived in an apartment, each person there was storage downstairs, but you brought your own lock, so you'd never be in this situation. So more realistically, it's like a downstairs storage room or something like that. And I'm sure something like this happens and people have to, I talked about cutting a lock. You can buy a master lock for, $20 or less. It's not a big deal. But what if you have to break in a door or something like that? And I've had not that exact situation, but I've had things where I had to like really damage something in order to get something important out, et cetera, like that. I mean, we could do an extreme thing. Can a firefighter break down a door to save someone's life? And I think everyone will say,
Yes.
yeah, because you're saving a life. There's no question there. And nobody is going to say that they have a responsibility. Forget if they're like, oh, as soon as I save their lives, I'll pay for a new door. No one's going to say that in the course of their job. But in this context, I'm trying to save myself from losing hundreds of dollars, but I am offering to replace the lock. So any other thoughts before we jump back into our sources? Excellent. So I will go ahead and share the screen again. So we're actually going to start, Ed, with your point, which is the kind of the baseline of protecting another's property. So Gloria, I think we're actually up to you. If you would take, again, 16th century. And as I said before, it's important to note that even though the Shulchan Aruch, which is the core of how we rule in most cases today, it's also reflective of both the Talmud from 1500 years ago, all the way back to the Torah, of course, thousands of years before, and hundreds of years of rabbinic opinions and debate. And even though the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century, 1563, is kind of the jumping off point, it is the jumping off point for today, there's plenty of debates about it. But what I'm bringing tonight are the generally accepted principles. So go ahead, Gloria, source number 1.
One is prohibited from damaging the money of others. If he damages, even if he does not benefit, he is required to pay the full amount of damage, even if it was unintentional or an unavoidable accident.
Excellent. So this is it's kind of connected actually to our first case a little bit, which is, so we talked about if a minor does damage, they're not culpable because they don't have, the wherewithal to understand what they're doing. But what happens if I, a fully cognizant adult, wake up from a scary dream and my arm shoots out? I'm staying at someone's house and I knock over a fancy vase and I break it. This says that I'm actually responsible for that, even though in that moment I wasn't cognizant. They say that an adult, Jew or person is responsible for all of the actions that they do because they should have been more careful. But this is the baseline. I am not allowed to damage one's property. Obviously, as we talked about, there's some obvious exception, saving someone's life. And that actually comes up in the case of if I see someone being chased by someone trying to kill them, can I grab someone's, potted plant and throw it at the attacker? These are really interesting cases. Am I then responsible for paying it back? I'm saving the life, et cetera, like that. Really interesting. But here, baseline is don't damage. But our case is not the same as that because I damaged A, to prevent a loss, and B, I knew that as soon as I was done damaging, I would replace it. So Elizabeth, source number 2, and I called this the Afikoman conundrum, and I'll explain why in a moment, but go ahead with source number 2.
It is forbidden to steal, even if it is a small amount, according to the judgment of the Torah.
And it is forbidden to steal, even if it is in a playful manner, even on the condition of returning it, or in order to repay double, or in order to cause pain. Everything is forbidden in order that he not accustom himself to this.
Excellent. So the reason I mentioned the Afikoman is at the end of a Pesach Seder, there's some families have a custom where the children will steal the Afikoman from the parent, and then they'll, haggle and basically blackmail the parents to get it back. According to the source, that would actually be forbidden. Even though it's a cute little game, And it actually gives a reason here. So someone they're not really stealing, but it's forbidden because one doesn't want to make that become accustomed to that. Now, even though it says stealing, most people or everyone understands this as applying to damaging as well. Now, here's the interesting thing though. Ed, you had said this looks like vandalism, but if I'm destroying something to save my property, and I know that I'm going to replace it, is it really vandalism? Now, the actual action is vandalism, but I'm not really destroying for the sake of destroying. So why then would it be forbidden? It would be forbidden because this is not a good thing to do. So again, the baseline ruling is, even though, as it says explicitly here, don't steal even if you intend to give it back, technically speaking, even though I intend to replace the lock, I still cannot do damage. Now, if we ended here, we'd be in deep trouble in this situation. I would not be allowed to do it. Now, having done it, obviously I would have to buy a new lock and replace the undo the damage I've done. But a priori, it seems like I can't do it. But we're going to go back in time now, 1500 plus years, to the Talmud, to a fascinating case, which happens to be super relevant. Now, the intro to this case is there's a lot of things where to give testimony on, if someone committed a crime, or for someone converting, or for someone getting married, usually it needs to be an adult Jewish male who is observant. But there are certain cases where an adult Jew who is a female is allowed to give testimony. This is one of those contexts. She's allowed to say what she saw in X case, and it's counted. We're not going to get into why that is or isn't. It is something for you to be like, I'm a little uncomfortable with that. That's fine. It's something to talk about, but it's not directly relevant to us right now. So having said that, Tamar, if you would take source number 3 all the way back in the Talmud, please.
Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka said, a woman or a minor whose testimony is not generally accepted by the court is deemed credible to say it was from here that this swarm emerged, and it therefore belongs to a certain individual, and one may walk into another field in order to salvage his own swarm of bees that has relocated there. And if he damages some property in the process, he must pay for what he has damaged. But if the bees settle on a branch of a tree, he may not cut off the other branch in order to take the bees, even on the condition that he will later give him the money for it. Rabbi Ishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, says he may even cut off a branch and later give him the money for it as compensation.
Excellent. So there's a few things going on here. So going back to the testimony thing, so I'm a beekeeper and my bees, and again, I don't know if this happens, it probably does, but let's say you have some bee fields or, beekeeper huts, whatever it is, beehives, fairly close to each other, and my bees, who I can't control them, they decide to fly off into my neighbor's, beehives. So what they're saying here is, in this case, if I go and I say, oh, those are my bees, well, do you have any proof or do you have any witnesses to that? So in this case, a woman or a minor could say, yes, I saw his bees fly over. It's accepted in this case. But the second part is, can I go over, rip open or lift up? That's I think that's what they're talking about here. Lift up their hut or whatever the bees are and bring it back to my property to get my bees back. And this is saying, yes, you can. You can damage someone else's property to save yourself from loss. Because if I lose all my bees and I can't get them back, I'm out of my livelihood. So this is a big deal. I'm losing a lot of money here. Therefore, in that case where I would lose money, I can damage as long as, and it's very clear, I pay it back. Now, the thing about the branch, again, you'd have to ask a beekeeper exactly what's going on here. But in the branch, the difference might be with a branch or with a hut, I can rebuild it. With a branch, I guess it'll grow back eventually, but it's harder to pay back for the damage to a tree. But we see an opinion that says, even in that case, you can do any damage you need to protect your livelihood and protect yourself from a big loss, as long as you make restitution to your neighbor, which hopefully is less than the loss that you would do. If I'm going to be out $500, but let's say locks cost $1,000, what makes more sense, to smash the lock, pay 1,000, or lose 500. But in this case, it's easier for me to damage my neighbor's property, pay them back $50, whatever, and save all of my fees. So based on this ruling, and actually the question is, how do we rule? And what's interesting is the answer is, so if we look at source number 4, and this is, again, the Shulchan Aruch was written by 2 authors. The Sephardic Israeli lived in Sfat, Rav Yosef Cairo, and then the Polish, I believe, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, Ramah. And this is what he says about that case, and it would be directly relevant to, can you damage someone's property to prevent a loss? Go ahead, please, add source number 4.
If one had a beehive and the bees left and sat on another's tree, there are those who say the bee owner can cut the branch in order to save his beehive, and he would pay the value of the tree to the tree owner. There are those who disagree.
So some say, yes, I could absolutely cut the lock, and some say no. And again, this ruling would directly relate to the case that we have in front of us. Now, what might happen is, depending on your rabbi, he may say, no, don't cut the lock, or do cut the lock. So in a case like this, don't call your rabbi, because you don't know how he's going to rule on this. However, because you have 2 valid opinions that one says you can, one says you can't, if you could hold by the one that does it, but if you've already done it, everyone would agree that, what's done is done. Now you just have to pay back. So again, there are some who would rule you can't cut the lock, some rule you can, but ultimately, again, don't call your rabbi until after the lock, and all they're going to say is either you should or you shouldn't, but it doesn't matter, pay it back now. But what we've seen is that there is an exception to the don't damage rule, where you're going to suffer a great loss, and B, you intend to pay it back. Now, if there's not this loss of livelihood, you can't damage something for fun. If I want to go into my friend's house because I want to watch the game on their big screen TV, they're not home, I'll smash in their back window so I can watch the game on their huge TV, and then I'll fix it later. Is that okay? No, absolutely not. But again, if I'm trying to sell something, a piece of jewelry, and I need it to pay off my student loans, and if I don't get it to the buyer by 6 p.m. tonight, my student loans are going to double, and I'm going to lose thousands of dollars. Can I then break into my friend's house to get the jewelry, sell it to the person? I know this is kind of a convoluted thing, but the answer is basically, you probably could do that. Some would say no, but enough would say yes. And again, once you've done it, you're fine. Hopefully, again, there's easier ways to get in your friend's house. But in our case, the answer would probably be yes, you could cut the lock, intending to give it back. Now, as I've said, some still disagree with this. So is there a way that everyone would agree that you could cut the lock? And the answer is yes. And it goes back to the idea of intention and what you have in mind. So that takes us to our last, so source number 5 here. Source number 5 here is just a general principle, ze nehene v'ze eino chaser. So that's the underlying principle to the beehive thing, which is, since even though I damaged my friend's property, I'm going to pay for it. So have they lost anything? Ultimately, at the end of the day, once everything is all made good, have they lost anything? And the answer is no. But if I don't do anything, obviously their property is fine, but will I lose something? And the answer is yes. So the underlying principle is that in this case, even though temporarily I'll damage my friend's property, ultimately I'll get everything back to normal. But I have I'm going to gain a lot here. I'm going to save myself tens of thousands, my entire livelihood, et cetera, like that. So even if I inconvenience someone, or not inconvenience, if I do something that someone prefer I don't do, but they don't really suffer in any ultimate way, but if I don't do it, I would, then I'm allowed to do it. So again, fundamentally, I'm not really causing them any long-term damage, but if I don't do anything, I'm in big trouble. That's the underlying principle. But now, as I said, the question before is there a way I could cut the lock? But everyone agrees it's fine. And Gloria, I'll have you take source number 6. And the thing I called it was H. Squires and Sons. I Googled best, best padlocks. And everyone was like a master lock for like $10 or less, which is great that the padlocks are really cheap. But in a moment, you'll see why I wanted to find a crazy expensive one, and I did. And this one was not thousands of dollars, but it's a couple $100s. I think it's like a British company, and they make the finest, fanciest. You need 2 keys to unlock it padlock. So you'll see why I brought that as an example in number 6, please. 1 is prohibited.
1 is prohibited from robbing, even on the condition to pay back something better. There are those who say this is only where the repayment is not in existence, because if it is in existence, since it is better than what he is taking, it is to the benefit of the owner, and he can have another person acquire it on behalf of the owner.
Now, this goes back to our principle before is, can I steal something knowing I'm going to give it back later? And the base ruling is absolutely not. Now, we saw that there might be an exception if the reason I'm stealing, let's say I need to borrow my friend's car so I can drive for a job interview or something like that. And if I don't get this job interview in this job, I won't have a job. I'm stealing my friend's car, not okay. But in that case, maybe it would be okay if I'll pay him for the gas and give him, pay him $50 for the time I took his car and any attendant damage. But if I say to my friend, or not, my friend isn't there and I can't ask permission, but I happen to have, he has a Honda CR-V, which is actually a really good car, but I happen to know that there's a BMW that, I'm going to be given tomorrow. And I call my friend and say, instead of giving me the BMW, give it to my friend. So I take his CR-V and I give him the BMW in place of it. In that case, it's not considered stealing. What I'm doing is basically trading up on his behalf. If I give him much better property, so in the beehive case, I need to take his beehive hut to get my bees back. But I happen to have a brand new hut that's made of solid titanium and it has GPS and everything like that. It has no bees in it. I'm going to bring it over to my friend's property, give it to him, and it's worth 10 times as much as his hut. Even though I'm taking his hut, I've already replaced it with something that's worth a lot more than his property. So how does that apply here? What I do is, before I go down and cut the lock, I go on to Amazon.com. I find a equal, actually not equal, it has to be better, a better in value padlock than the landlord has. It can be by $5 or an H. Squire and Sons, and I click order. Then I have now given him better property. I've given him a financial benefit. I've made money for him. I've given him a great gift. Because of that, now his old lock, he probably wouldn't even want anymore, and I have permission to cut it. So again, I'll give a moment for that to sink in, because this is a weird exception of the case. Again, I can't just go into someone's house and start taking their dishes and then give them new dishes. But in this case, if there's a reason that I need to temporarily take their property, but I'm able to replace it with something not equal, it has to be better. There has to be an advantage, a benefit for them, so that most people, doesn't matter what they actually want, most people would say, oh yeah, if you called me and said you're going to buy me a better lock, I could say you could have my lock, no problem. Oh yeah, you're going to get me a BMW? You can have my Honda CR-V, I don't care. If most people would say that, then it's not stealing anymore. Not stealing. You basically replaced it with something much better. And again, it has to be better. And in that case, if I order them an H. Squire and Sons, now here the language is actually, it has to be in existence. So I'm being fudging a little by saying ordering from Amazon counts. I think most would be okay with that. But as long as I'm getting them something better, everyone would agree that this is no longer damaging or stealing, and then it's fine. They don't care about their old lock. They're happy to get a fancy new lock. Questions? Here, I'll stop sharing it. Yeah, any final thoughts, comments, or questions on that case? And by the way, I'll just, before Elizabeth, that last thing that I brought is so that everyone would agree it's okay to break the lock. Many, at least half of people, would say you don't need to do that. As long as you plan on replacing the lock with something of equal value, then it's fine. But if you want everybody to be on board, you need to replace it with something much better, so that for them, it's not stealing anymore. They're like, oh, I don't even, again, if they knew about it, they would say, I don't care, take it. And again, we don't care what they would actually say. If they're like, oh, that padlock was from my great-great-grandmother, something like that. Most people don't have something like that. We, in Jewish law, we generally go by what most people would say. And if they knew they were getting an H. Squire and Sons padlock, they would say, oh my gosh, you did me a favor, kind of thing like that. Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth, please.
So back to the discussion about the afikomen and the people getting in the habit. As we were going through some of these cases, I was thinking, yeah, you had the intent to replace whatever it was, but then you thought, oh, you know what? He has 7 beehives. I only have 1.
I'm really struggling. He doesn't need anything big. Okay, so I made a decision, but then it didn't pan out, kind of a thing, you know, where they give themselves a reasonable excuse not to go through with it.
Yeah. And I think about, it's unrelated, but perhaps in a similar vein, is people who go into a supermarket and they'll grab a candy bar and they'll eat it and then they'll pay for it when they go out. Now, technically that's actually not permitted, because since they haven't paid for it, it's not yet their property. They haven't actually taken ownership of it, so they are stealing by eating it. But let's say it was technically okay to do. It's not good practice, because then you get in the habit of, you know, using things before you're really supposed to, and eventually it might turn into real theft. So the reason we have any flexibility in our case is because this isn't regular theft. This is because of discouraging. It's a little bit of an unusual case, but the action itself is still technically damaging someone's property, which is generally forbidden. So you do need all of these qualifying factors. The most basic factor, the 2 basic factors are A, you intend to replace it, and B, you'll suffer a great loss. And again, many would prefer that when you intend to replace it, you actually, you know, really are going to replace it with a much nicer one. So it takes it totally out of the category of damaging. You're basically just helping them remove their old property so that you can bring in their really nice new one. And again, my Amazon example, some might say that's not technically what it says. So I'm saying I think that's a valid understanding of it, but I'm open to someone disagreeing with me. But I think that's a reasonable read for our cases. Other thoughts, comments, or questions?
It's interesting because the morality of it, or the what is obligated, is very much based on, you know, what actually helps everybody out in the long run. You know, it's not so much about the act itself. It's like, what is the benefit? What is the final benefit for me and the person who had the lock?
Two of the greatest rabbis in rabbinic history, Rabbi Akiva and Hillel, both talk about, you know, one of the fundamental mitzvot of the Torah is to love. You know, love your neighbor as yourself, or what is hateful to you, do not do unto others. And then the question is, how do I love someone as myself? And the rabbis say, well, we can't obligate someone to have an emotional feeling. So what they do is they say, the more broad way is the way that I would want to be treated or not treated. I don't want someone to yell at me or hit me or something like that. I shouldn't do that to others. But they actually talk about property. I would want someone to protect my property, my well-being, and my physical property. So too, I have that obligation toward others. So how do I show that love and respect for other human beings? By making sure that their property, whether, you know, financially, physical property, and of course their physical well-being, are protected. So it is a very fundamental Jewish value to make sure that people's things are not, you know, like Rousseau, the social contract is, I respect your property, you respect mine. Now, if I'm in a case where I have to disrespect your property because I'm in an exceptional situation, but this is the key, goes back to what I was saying about the way I would want to be treated. If I knew that my friend was going to be in a whole world of hurt, would lose thousands of dollars, and they would make it good to me, would I probably be okay with it? And the question is, what would most people do? And I would hope that most people would say, yeah, that's probably fine. Again, the fundamental principle is don't damage others' property. But in these exceptional cases, most would be okay with it. And by the way, if I could call the landlord and ask, none of this would be an issue. This is where I can't ask. It's the question about borrowing. I did a whole class on borrowing. Can I borrow someone's stuff? There are times when you can, times when you can't. But if I could ask them, it wouldn't be a question. So most Jewish cases are where you're not able to communicate with the other person clearly, or you don't have a record about what you agreed upon. And the truth is that's probably on the, you know, on all of the Judge Judy shows. 90% of the time it's we disagree about what actually happened, but if you have a clear record, then it's not an issue.